As the birds sang, dusk settled slowly over Willows Grove. Isabel and Aaron laid on their backs in the soft grass under a canopy of willow trees. It was from these very trees that the town got its name. As a child, Isabel had climbed them for hours on end. Then when she was a little older, she told them all her secrets and dreams. Now, she would often bring the school children here to read them their lessons. It was a sacred place to her, and so fittingly, it was under these trees that Aaron had proposed. Isabel held her hand up in the fading light to admire again the engagement ring he had given her. "I can hardly wait for the day we are married, and the evening no longer means saying goodbye." Aaron stretched out his arms and yawned, then rolled over so he was face to face with Isabel.
"It won't be long now, my love. Just a few more months and we will be together forever."
Then he kissed her softly on the cheek. In the distance, someone began frantically ringing the large bell in the town square. It startled them both. It was a bell that was only to be rung if the town was in danger. The two raced to the town square, where it seemed everyone was gathered. On the ground, in the middle of the square, lay 3 dead bodies. Flies swarmed around the rotting corpses. It was an awful sight. They were men from town, or at least they had been men. Now they were unrecognizable, shriveled, stinking husks, and their skin clung to their bones like wet clothing. It was as if all their blood had been drained, yet there was no trauma to the bodies, except a tiny hole at the tip of each man's ring finger. A traveling parson spoke up.
"Only dark magic could do such evil as that to a man. In my travels, I have heard many tales of warlocks, witches, and terrible beasts of the deep woods. Whatever it is, we must strike it down now, before it grows bolder."
The miller seemed to agree and declared,
"All able-bodied men, go now and gather whatever weapons you have. We will meet back here at sunset, and we shall hunt down whatever evil overtook these men."
Aaron gathered the hunting knives his father had left him. Isabel pleaded with him to let her join the hunting party, but he would not hear of it. She agreed to stay behind under the condition that he leave a trail of corn for her to follow if for some reason the party hadn't returned by morning. As the sun set, 20 men assembled in the town square with knives, pitchforks, axes, crossbows, and they promised to return before sunrise. Isabel waited in the square for her Aaron to return. She was far too distressed to do anything else. When the men had not returned by midnight, Isabel knew she had to do something. She couldn't just wait idly by until morning. She ran home and put on her working smock. Then she went from house to house to try to persuade others in town to join her, but they locked their doors and turned down their lamps. So, alone she followed Aaron's trail of corn to the top of the ridge, with nothing but a small oil lantern to light her way. The path up the ridge was rough and steep. The wind whistled through the trees, and in her mind it sounded like voices screaming in the distance. When Isabel reached the top of the ridge, the trail of corn stopped, then seemed to circle back down the ridge and veer to the right, deeper into the woods. The hooting of owls from the hollows of old trees caused Isabel to shiver. As she trudged further into the darkness, she was beset on all sides by the haunting sounds of wolves howling and the rumbling hooves of deer crashing desperately through the thicket. And then Isabel smelled a fire. Had the men stopped in the woods to camp for the night? As she got closer to the smell, she noticed a pillar of smoke. To her surprise, it was not from a campfire, but the chimney of a small cabin. Isabel had never heard of anyone living this far out in the deep woods. The cabin seemed abandoned and was dark except for the soft flickering glow from the fire burning somewhere inside. Surely the men had chosen to sleep here. As she entered the circular stone yard in front of the cabin, the trees around began to creak and sway in the breeze. Then she heard a few scattered drops of rain. A few drops fell on her arm. Then she slipped on the wet ground and fell backwards into a wooden barrel, knocking it over. The contents of the barrel spread slowly over the yard. She saw that her lamp had smashed apart in the fall, and the spilled oil burned for just a moment in the thick, dark liquid. Then she realized it wasn't rainwater, it was blood. Horrified, she looked up. Hanging upside down from the trees encircling the yard were the bodies of the men from town. Each was dripping his blood from a single finger into a separate barrel below. Isabel screamed, then frantically, and perhaps selfishly, began searching for Aaron's face among the swinging bodies. He was nowhere to be found, which was some relief. But his hunting knives lay at the roots of one of the trees, so he had been there. She took one of the knives and tied it to her waist. Behind her, the cabin door shut with a heavy bang that made her almost jump out of her skin. It must be her sweet Aaron. Had he hidden in the cabin from the evil that had claimed the lives of the other men? To hide oneself from evil was not cowardice. She would not judge him. She would be grateful he was alive. And if for some reason he was too ashamed to return to Willows Grove, she would gladly follow him anywhere. Isabel reached out her trembling hand and knocked on the cabin door, assuming Aaron had barred it shut from the inside, but the door creaked open on its own and the flickering light spilled out. She leaned inside and nervously called out, "Aaron!" But there was no answer. From the doorway she could see the fire crackling in the stone fireplace. Cautiously she entered the cabin. Broken jars, leather wine flasks, and rolled tobacco littered the room, like the remains from a wild party. The spilled wine had stained nearly every inch of the wooden floor. Then she saw Aaron. He was sitting motionless on a wooden stool in front of the fire. Isabel was relieved to see him alive. As she moved closer, she called his name again. "Aaron?" But he didn't respond or even look in her direction. Suddenly, she heard a woman's voice call from somewhere in the shadows.
"Does this one belong to you?"
Then from a dark corner of the room, a figure rose from the makeshift bed there and stepped out into the flickering firelight. It was an alluringly dressed young woman. Her blouse was torn open a bit at the top, and there was a bloody stain over her heart. Isabel wrapped her arms around Aaron's shoulders protectively. "What's wrong with him?" she asked.
"Your little boy, Blue, is perfectly fine. His friends, though, were not so lucky."
"Why won't he look at me? Why won't he speak?" Isabel demanded.
"He's under my spell now. He kept his life because he was the only virtuous one out of the lot of them. A pity how that works. The blood of a righteous man is infinitely more potent and yet so troublesome to attain."
"What do you mean, he's under your spell?" Isabel asked, confused.
"I am a witch, dear. The one they call Magley."
"And you killed all those men?"
"No, dear. Those men died by their own hand. And I simply let them."
Magley pulled down the blood-stained portion of her blouse a bit to reveal a sharp black stone protruding from her heart.
"It is this stone that curses me, and anyone who dares to lay a finger on it. Even the lightest touch would cause one to bleed and never stop. That is what happened to those men, and they absolutely deserved it."
You lured them to their deaths with wine and a dry place to rest.
No, girl. I stand before you now just as I did before them, and you have not lost all self-control. These men were beasts, and so they died like beasts. Don't you dare pity them.
But why have you hung them from the trees and collected their blood? Isabel asked.
I must bathe in the blood of men to remain young and beautiful, lest I turn into one of those old crones you've surely read about.
Please, just let my Aaron go. He's a good man. You said so yourself, Isabel pleaded. Magli traced Aaron's face with her long fingernail.
I'm afraid I can't just let him go. He did, after all, come here to kill me. No, I have already used the spell of service on him. He will do as I say for the rest of his life.
But we're to be married. Please, I'll do anything. Please. Magli stared deep into Isabel's eyes, as if testing her resolve.
There is one thing, I suppose. A book that was stolen from me. It contained a spell that would keep me young and beautiful for 1,000 years. If you could return it to me, I would no longer require the blood of men. But I'm afraid you are far too delicate for such a task.
Please, you must let me try, Isabel implored.
You will do everything I say? Exactly as I demand it? No excuses?
Yes, of course, Isabel said. Magli laughed. Then with a long fingernail she plucked a shard of obsidian stone from her heart. It seemed to cause her immense pain. Then she broke the shard in two.
With one half you must pierce your sweet Aaron's heart, and the other you must wear around your neck. Only your half of the stone can remove your lover's half. You mustn't dare lose it. In 3 sunsets the stone will reach his heart. That is all the time you have to find the warlock, the one who stole my book of spells. You must return the book to me before the bleeding starts. If you fail, your Aaron's precious lifeblood belongs to me.
Isabel hated to agree to such a disgusting thing, but she had no choice. She couldn't live without her love. And so she made the promise. She pressed the obsidian piece into Aaron's chest as gently as she could, but he still recoiled in pain.
Perfect,
Magli said coldly. Then she began to explain to Isabel the task in more detail. The warlock, she said, lived across the poison swamp. A splinter from a blood tree would weaken the warlock and cause him to sprout roots that would bind him to the ground, allowing Isabel to retrieve the book of spells. This would eventually turn the warlock into a blood tree as well. Magli warned that just getting to the warlock would not be easy. He had enchanted his forest to keep Magli away. Isabel would surely encounter snares and obstacles, and she must overcome them with just her courage and wit. Finally, Magli set Isabel's half of the obsidian stone in a necklace and placed it around her neck. Isabel's lantern had long burned out, but the necklace, when exposed, would attract wood sprites, whose glow would light her way through the midnight forest where the blood tree stood. She gave Isabel a burlap sack with a loaf of bread and a large jar filled with water.
If you are prudent, this will be just enough for your journey. There will be no time for sleep. Each bite of bread and each drink of water must serve as your respite.
Then she pointed Isabel west to the midnight forest and told her once she reached the point where the woods were so thick that the sky could not be seen, and trees seemed to watch and whisper, she would find the blood tree. How will I know which tree is the blood tree? Isabel asked. As she turned, she caught just a glimpse of Magli as she floated through the trees and disappeared into the darkness. The howling screams that Isabel had heard earlier on the trail followed her. Terrified, she set off on her journey to the midnight forest. She thought it must be nearly morning and expected the sky to lighten, but it just grew darker and darker the further she went. Soon the woods became so dense that it was almost impossible to see. And so she looked up. There was not even a sliver of sky. Then she began to hear the whispers, and the trees and grasses seemed menacing. The forest was nearly pitch black, except for tiny dots of light dancing here and floating there. The wood sprites, she remembered, and she pulled the necklace out from under her blouse. The sprites were drawn to it immediately, a dozen of them, cherubic faces but with an angry disposition. They glowed brighter the harder they fought to be closest to the shard of obsidian. The necklace began to glow too, like hot coals, and it burned Isabel's skin. In a panic, she removed it from her neck and flung it on the damp ground. Steam rose from the ground as the sprites fluttered about. Isabel grabbed a wet branch from the forest floor, and she hung the necklace from the end of the branch. The sprites swarmed around the necklace and glowed like a torch. Now she had plenty of light. She looked around for a blood tree, but all the trees looked the same. She stumbled over a large root and fell into a tree branch. Then another branch clapped onto her back, and they both squeezed together around her midsection and lifted her into the air. Somehow, she held on to her makeshift torch as the branch-like pincers continued to tighten around her waist. Suddenly, she was face to face with the biggest tree she had ever seen, and its trunk was gnarled and twisted into a face like a demon. Its eyes were the knots of the tree, and they glowed like a jack-o'-lantern. The mouth was the hollow trunk, and the teeth were sharply snapped timbers.
Who dares disturb my sleep? Who dares enter my forest?
The tree demanded, as dusty wind rushed out of its mouth, carrying on it the rotten smell of death. My name is Isabel. I've come looking for the blood tree to ask him for just a splinter from his mighty trunk, she said timidly. The tree groaned deeply, and more rotten air blew into Isabel's face, but she didn't dare show any disgust or fear.
Hideous creature, you expect me to just give you a piece of my body?
The tree groaned again, then squeezed Isabel even tighter. She gasped for air, then tried to pry herself some from the blood tree's grip as she begged. Please, there must be something I can do for you in exchange. Something to earn your goodwill. The tree groaned even louder, so loud that the forest shook and the woodland creatures fled in all directions. Then, all at once, there was silence, and the tree loosened his grip as if something had just occurred to him.
There is one thing that I desire, but I'm afraid it is beyond your power to give.
Please, great wise tree, I must save my true love from the spell of a witch, and in order to do that, I need just a tiny sliver of your magnificence. And that seemed to delight the tree.
Oh, how I do despise witches. But the task I would ask of you is nearly impossible. Giants with enchanted armor have failed.
But I must try, great tree, whatever the task may be, Isabel replied. Begrudgingly, the tree began.
In order for me to be free, to go where I wish, to seek others like myself, I must have a cup of blood from a magic beast. Such a beast lives just beyond the poison swamp, but it would never enter my forest. In order to pierce the beast, so you can spill its precious blood, you will need a magic blade. Many years ago, a giant tried to cut me down with his magic axe. An impossible task. He died trying, and his axe has been painfully lodged in my side ever since. You can use the axe to cut the beast. Here, pass through my trunk. It is the safest way.
The blood tree opened, its mouth wide, and the rotten smell billowed out in clouds of green.
If somehow you succeed, little one, I will owe you much more than a splinter.
The path through the tree was serpentine and surprisingly long. It went up into the tree and then below ground, and it was filled with flesh-eating bugs and poisonous snakes that thankfully were repelled by the light of the sprites. After walking for what seemed like forever, Isabel noticed a sliver of light in the distance. She was relieved to have finally reached the end. She peered out of the opening, carefully surveying the outside before exiting. There was a beam of light illuminating the sandy ground about a tree's length away from her, and she walked towards it. She searched the dense tree line at the edge of the sandy clearing with her torch. Suddenly, she was startled by her own reflection. Against a large tree, just a few feet from the beam of light, lay a giant metal shield, polished to a mirror-like finish. Isabel looked up into the dense foliage above. The light shined from the only crack in the canopy. She turned to look back at the giant blood tree, awed once again by its monstrous size. At the base of the mighty tree was a gleaming axe. It must be the magic axe, she thought, and she moved to retrieve it from the trunk. But just then, an awful high-pitched sound made her stop in her tracks. The sprites dispersed, then retreated into the tall tree that the bright shield lay against. The screeching sound seemed to be coming from the branch directly above the axe, but when Isabel looked up, there was nothing there. She took another step forward, and the sound came again. It was painful and piercing.
Hey, you down there. Move back into the light if you want to survive.
A voice called out to her.
Hurry, she's getting upset.
Isabel didn't argue and rushed back into the beam of light shining through the canopy. The horrible sound stopped.
She absolutely hates the sunlight,
the voice said. It seemed to be coming from the dark void just below the lowest branch of the blood tree. It was nearly impossible to see in the soft light, but just there, seemingly floating in mid-air, was a hazy skeleton figure. Isabel squinted her eyes to see better. A massive, dusty old spiderweb spanned from the middle of the low branch down to the base of the blood tree's trunk. The skeleton was ensnared at the center of the web.
Please don't leave me here. You must help me. You are the first soul I have seen in years, and I desperately need to get back to my garden.
The skeleton pleaded. How did you end up in such a mess in the first place? Isabel asked.
I too came for the magic axe. But as you can see, I was captured instead. It is the only thing that can remove the vile zombie weeds from my garden so that the souls there can rest in peace. A soul that cannot rest will wander, and the longer we wander, the more we forget, until one day we become lost forever. But what need have you of a magic axe?
The skeleton asked. I must use it to withdraw a cup of blood from the magic beast that lives across the poison swamp, Isabel replied.
Ah yes, the fierce Ursuline. Well, you won't get anywhere near that axe before the she-beast captures you too.
Then he looked to the limb above him. That's when Isabel saw it. Peeking from the darkness were two sets of glowing red eyes. It was the spider who had spun the web. Its body alone was as big as the miller's water wheel back home.
It must be dinner time, and she can't eat a lost soul like me, much to her displeasure. But you, she'd snatch you right up and bury her giant fangs deep in your belly. Her venom keeps the brain alive while slowly melting the bones and guts into a bloody soup. She'd drink you up through your nose. Once your body was sucked dry, she'd devour it slowly, legs first so that you could watch as her giant pincers pulled you into her crunching mouth piece by piece. And you'd feel every bite. Mercy won't come until she has swallowed your head. But that seems to be her favorite part, and she likes to savor it. Get me down from here, then I will help you retrieve your cup of blood.
But how? Isabel asked, exasperated.
I've had plenty of time to think on this. Her only weakness is her fear of the sun. You see where the light you are standing in comes from a hole in the canopy above?
Yes, I see that, Isabel replied.
And you see how close the beam of light is to that giant shield that's as shimmery as a crystal lake?
Isabel nodded.
If we can somehow widen that hole in the canopy enough that the light beam could reach that shield, then it should reflect directly into the web and scare the spider away. The problem is that the leaves up there are bigger than your own body, and it would take someone 3 times your size to pluck them from the trees. A magic axe could cut them easily, but we already know why that's not an option.
Isabel grasped her necklace as she thought for a moment. For some reason, it made her feel as though Aaron was near. I know what to do, Isabel declared finally. The skeleton might have asked her what her plan was, had she paused. But she was already climbing the tree that the giant shield lay against. Soon she disappeared into the mass of branches. Inside the dark, leafy confines of the tree, hundreds of sprites danced from limb to limb. They would clumsily fly into one another, starting little skirmishes that continued until they bumped into something else. Isabel climbed until she reached the hole in the canopy. It was small, no wider than a bushel. She crawled out carefully on a branch that held the biggest bundle of leaves.
"She's coming for you!"
She heard the skeleton shout from far below. Somewhere across from her, just out of the light, something came scuttling over branches and through the leaves. Then came the awful familiar chatter that was the spider's shrill warning. Nestled inside a bundle of leaves on a branch that crossed the one that Isabel now straddled, hid the spider, eyes gleaming and mouth dripping with foamy venom. It had stalked her all the way from the opposite side, and now it was staring directly at her, waiting for any opportunity to pounce. Isabel nervously removed her obsidian necklace and laid it in front of her across the branch. Almost immediately, every sprite in the tree swarmed the obsidian stone, and the chain began to heat up again until it was glowing white hot. Instantly, the bark on the branch began to smoke, and soon it was burning. The wood burned steadily, and soon the necklace cut through the entire branch, and both fell to the ground. This opened up a massive hole in the canopy, and she hoped it was enough. Isabel descended the tree, and as she neared the ground, she could see that the beam of light from the canopy was shining on the gleaming shield.
"It's working!"
she heard the skeleton say. Isabel climbed the rest of the way to the ground, then walked cautiously toward the spider's web. She could not see the she-beast, but somewhere in the darkness it was pulling its web from the tree. One by one, each attachment of the web pulled away. Isabel worried for a moment when the skeleton was dragged by the web, up and over the lowest branch, but it clung to the branch with all its might, and the web snapped away from its body, setting it free. The skeleton dropped from the branch to the ground, then wasted no time pulling the magic axe from the blood tree. The skeleton was much larger than it appeared in the web. It ran towards Isabel with the axe in hand, and for a moment she was frightened, but it just wrapped its arms around her and thanked her profusely for her help.
What is the name of the brave soul who saved me?
My name is Isabel,
Isabel. What a lovely name.
And what is your name? Isabel asked.
I don't remember. The only name I can recall is the name Joshua, but I don't think that is my name.
It's a splendid name, though, Isabel said.
Well then, Joshua I shall be, at least for now.
Then Isabel remembered the necklace. She had seen it fall from the tree when the branch had burned, but there was no telling where it landed. She and Joshua searched the sun-kissed ground near the fallen branch. Isabel was the first to find it. "Oh no!" she exclaimed, devastated as she knelt on the ground. The necklace was intact, but the obsidian stone had been crushed to bits smaller than grains of sand. She had not told Joshua the importance of the stone, but he seemed to understand and tried to comfort her. All she could do now was bring Magli her book of spells and hope that she could be reasoned with. Isabel and Joshua walked hand in hand until they reached the Garden of the Dead. The garden seemed grey, as if covered in soot, and the ground was grassless and muddy. Withered, slimy weeds dotted the garden and seemed to be the only thing thriving there.
These are the dreaded zombie weeds, the vile creatures that disturb our peace and claim all life unfortunate enough to stumble into this once beautiful garden. They have driven the souls buried here out into the swamp where they wander restlessly. The gas from the swamp seems to entrance the souls and scare away the creatures that would naturally eat the zombie weed. Somehow I wandered clear of the swamp, or else I too would be stumbling around in circles out there.
As Joshua spoke, Isabel came to the dark realization that zombie weeds were more precisely disembodied arms bursting from the ground. Bony and sparsely covered with chunks of wet, rotting flesh, and from somewhere inside, they produced a haunting, moaning sound that never ceased. The slender arms swayed back and forth, as if by some phantom wind, and they reached out desperately for something, anything, to grab a hold of. Occasionally, one weed would grab another and rip it from the ground. The uprooted weed would scream horribly as it was pulled underground, only to sprout up again a few moments later. The terrible noise of all this moaning and ripping and screaming was maddening.
Can you imagine trying to sleep with that incessant noise? The only way to kill them is to chop off the hands, and only a blade imbued with magic can do that. Hold out your burlap sack and I will toss them to you to catch. As long as you stay within the space of the garden, the poison mist will not reach you. Don't let the weeds hit the ground or they will root and grow again. And by all means, don't let them grab you or they'll pull you down into the underground where you can never escape.
Joshua set to killing the weeds with a sadistic glee.
Here, catch!
Once all the hands had been removed and lay harmlessly in the burlap sack, the garden ground seemed to rumble, and the grey mud turned dark and loamy, and great beautiful flowers budded from the ground, then shot up as tall as Isabel's waist. The smell was intoxicating, and Isabel was struck with an overwhelming urge to lay down and sleep.
We must make a meal for the Ursuline. There is almost nothing they like more than the zombie weed. We'll mix in crumbs of your bread with these red flowers here. They have a tranquilizing effect that will make our magic beast sleep. Then there will be plenty of time to safely collect your cup of blood.
Joshua carried the axe, and Isabel carried her water jar and the sack of weeds and flowers as they left the garden for the forest. After just a few steps, Isabel caught a whiff of the most awful smell, like vomit and rotten fish. Directly in front of them was a steaming pile of dung, the size of a small hill. Hundreds of half-digested zombie weeds wriggled throughout the pile like worms.
Only the Ursuline could create such a foul mess. It won't be long before it returns. We must be ready.
They marched upwind, away from the pile, where there seemed to be a well-trod path. Joshua dropped a pile of zombie weeds in the middle of the path, where the beast was certain to find them, then mixed in the medicinal flowers and breadcrumbs. Isabel and Joshua both hid in the rotted-out trunk of a nearby tree and waited for the beast to come. In the midnight forest, it was difficult to determine if it was night or day, but somehow it seemed to grow darker, and Isabel's senses told her that the sun was setting for the second time. She had no way of knowing for sure, though. She could only complete her quest as quickly as possible and hope she returned in time. Isabel awoke suddenly. She chastised herself for falling asleep. As she stirred, Joshua placed his bony palm over her mouth and pointed outside of the tree. Isabel heard the sound of a large animal snorting and grunting close by. She sat up to see the Ursuline about 100 steps away, eating the zombie weed but leaving the red flowers. "Why doesn't it eat the flowers?" she whispered.
It's a wild beast, but it's lived a long time. Perhaps it's seen this trick before. Stand here,
Joshua said as he pointed to an internal knot above the hollow opening of the tree. She did as Joshua asked, and then he sat the axe upright so that the handle was on the ground and the axe head rest in her hands.
If the Ursuline comes for you before the flowers have taken effect, let go of the axe as soon as he sticks his head in.
Then he began to stuff the remaining red flowers into his ribcage. "Wait, what are you doing?" Isabel exclaimed.
Isabel, I've told you 2 lies. You were not the first person to find me in the spider's web, but you were the only one to stop and hear my pleas, and for that I owe you everything. And second, when I told you that there was nothing that a magic beast loves more than zombie weed, I should have added, nothing but a lost soul, that is.
Then he left the safety of the tree. "No!" Isabel screamed. Through a crack in the trunk, she watched as the beast's attention turned to Joshua. Zombie weed fell from its mouth as it stalked its prey.
Come and get it, you wretched beast,
Joshua shouted, and in the blink of an eye, the beast was on top of him. It roared loudly as it tore Joshua apart, so loudly that the inside of the tree vibrated with the sound. Joshua screamed, but it couldn't have been from pain. Perhaps it was terror. The terror of not knowing what was next. What was the next plane of existence for a lost soul? All Isabel knew is that she couldn't bear to listen to the terrible noises any longer. The axe fell from her hands as she covered her ears and wept for her friend.